Thanks for coming, everyone. I think we are ready to start. So it's my pleasure to introduce Katie Potter today. So Katie is from Southwest Colorado. She did her undergrad at Fort Lewis. And I was telling her that my first graduate students actually at the U was also from Fort Lewis.
There's at least 2 people that have graduated in Fort Lewis.
She did a master at Idaho State University, and then she did her PhD at Utah State University, and she got her PhD in 2014. And then she went working for several oil and mining companies before joining Utah State University as an assistant professor of practice since 2020. I actually met Katie 3 years ago. We were both attending a workshop on the East Coast about how to teach petrology in the 21st century. That's how I met her. And so most of her research focus on whole rock geochemistry, on basalt and geocores, with a focus on mantle plume system. And that's what you are going to talk about today. So thank you, Katie.
Yeah, and just as a caveat, thank you. Just as a caveat, the stuff I learned at the Teaching Petrology workshop isn't really featured here. So this isn't how I would normally teach this stuff. This is going to be a fire hose of plume geochemistry. So yeah, it's not, it doesn't reflect the wonderful things we learned, I guess is a way of saying that. Today I'm going to be talking about drill core specifically and how we can use drill core to interpret processes that are originating in the core mantle boundary and impacting what we see on the surface today. And I want to start out with a little bit of intro geology review and looking at Earth's interior structure. And most of what we know of these physical and chemical boundaries is due to geophysical measurements, specifically P-wave velocity and S-wave velocities that fluctuate in response to density and temperature contrasts at various steps. What's less certain, and not to imply that we know everything there is to know about geophysics, but in the world I occupy, geochemistry world, we're really interested in the geochemical heterogeneity that exists in the lower mantle in contrast to pretty relatively uniform geochemical signatures in the upper mantle. The upper mantle has been continuously kind of extracted from or impacted by crustal forming processes over billions of years, whereas the lower mantle has been largely isolated. So the lower mantle is kind of this mysterious sort of province for geochemists, and we like to figure out how we can learn what's going on down there. Also, one other mystery is how plume magmatism, originating down here, interacts with continental crust and oceanic crust in different ways. So I've structured this talk kind of following a stratigraphic framework. I'll first kind of set up some background information. And this is mostly methods related. I'm hopefully going to convince you that basalts are wonderful and interesting rocks. Do a quick primer on scientific drilling and mantle plumes. And then we'll dive right into results from the Yellowstone Snake River Plain hotspot track and then the Tristan Gulf Walvis hotspot track. One of which, this is continental crust, and the other is oceanic crust. And I'll share some results from work I've done in these areas. And then I'll summarize and then you can ask me questions. Some of the questions I hope to answer today, or in the process of collecting all this data, is sort of broadly what petrogenetic processes are taking place in continental crust versus oceanic crust in response to plume processes. And just to back up a little bit, petrogenesis is just the origin and evolution of magma. So it's a fancy word that describes kind of a broad concept, is that magmas change composition over time, and their geochemical information can provide information about both of these sort of fundamental characteristics. The other question I'm going to answer, or hopefully answer, is the timing of magma petrogenesis and magmatism, or volcanism in the Yellowstone Snake River Plain. And then looking at oceanic settings, this Tristan-Walvis or Tristan-Guff-Walvis hotspot track, using geochemical information to determine whether magma petrogenesis changes depending on where we are along the hotspot track, and even within a single location. So I've lived in Utah for about 10 years, and one of my big complaints about the state is there's not a lot of basalt. What we do have are kind of small pockets in the western and southern part of the state, and they're relatively young and largely associated with basin and range extension. Throughout the world, though, basalts are a major part of the landscape. They're the most common rock type on Earth. They're produced in basically every plate tectonic process associated with magma, as well as intraplate processes like plumes. And they're derived from partial melting of the mantle. They also contain a geochemical record of all of not only the source from which they derive through partial melting, but also all of the different processing, different differentiation that can occur in that magma as it's making its way to the surface. And one of the key data sets that we can use are trace elements. And I like trace elements because they're a lot easier to obtain than isotopes, radiogenic isotopes. And one of the major clues that trace elements can give us is kind of a fingerprint of source. And this relies on the fact that trace elements vary in whether they're compatible or easily integrated into a crystal lattice, or incompatible, meaning it's more difficult to kind of shove them in and get them to fit together in a mineral. And we can kind of subcategorize incompatible elements as either large ion lithophile, meaning they have large ionic radius and they're too big to easily fit in a crystal lattice, or high field strength elements, which have a higher ionic charge, and it's more difficult to balance that charge using anions or anion groups. These two behave differently in igneous systems. So large ion lithophiles are the last to be pulled into a crystallizing mineral phase and the first to melt out in response to high heat or even fluid interactions. They're very fluid mobile. High field strength elements are also some of the last minerals to crystallize in a cooling magma reservoir. But once they're in a mineral, they kind of lock in. They're really sort of refractory or resistant to melting. And that's one of the reasons why zircons are such a really great tool for dating systems, because zircon is a high field strength, or zirconium is a high field strength element and preserves that information. And then we have the large rare earth element or light rare earth elements, and the heavy rare earth elements also plotted on this x-axis. On the y-axis, we have sort of averaged concentrations from different source locations, and these are normalized to primitive mantle, which is kind of a idealized composition for the early Earth mantle. And what I want to point out here are the different characteristics in these line segments. So starting with the bulk continental crust, it's blue in here. We see some spikes and troughs that represent enrichment and depletion in various trace elements. What those represent are enrichment in incompatible elements. So these elements over here, which reflect kind of continuous enrichment of the continental crust due to magma differentiation, fractional crystallization, and sort of fluids coming up, bringing all those large ion lithophiles with them and sort of fertilizing the continental crust. The next category, ocean island basalts, this green line, this is what I'll be talking about today with respect to the Tristan-Guff-Walvis hotspot system, is characterized by really high enrichment in the large ion lithophile and high field strength elements, and then kind of the tapering down into heavy rare earth elements. And what this reflects is deep, low degree partial melts of lower mantle or enriched sources. So that lower mantle that's been kind of isolated from crustal forming processes. Island arc basalts have this really characteristic spike in large ion lithophiles and a dip in high field strength elements. That's because subducting oceanic lithosphere, all those fluids coming off, interact with the mantle wedge and contribute these large ion lithophile elements. But those high field strength elements are locked into oceanic lithosphere, and they just kind of go on down to the core mantle boundary. And so these island arc lavas do not contain high amounts, high concentrations of those. And then the fourth category, mid-ocean ridge basalts, these are a product of shallow high degree partial melts of the upper mantle. So they're almost uniformly depleted in our incompatible elements. And these are what are produced at locations like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge today. All right, so we can use kind of more complicated spider diagrams like this to pinpoint source or the origin story for basalt lavas. But we can use more simple diagrams as well, just looking at sort of a Harker style diagram of two trace elements and kind of grouping our erupted products from various settings into these fields. So we can learn a lot initially just from plotting up trace elements. Another way we can use geochemistry is by looking at actually understanding processes that might take place in relatively shallow magma chambers. These are all data from the Snake River Plain, so an area I'll be talking in more detail about shortly. This is all drill core data. So these represent several pulses of magmatism from individual magma chambers. But collectively, we can see some general trends popping out. We would expect if we had fractional crystallization occurring that our magnesium number would actually decrease kind of uniformly at a stable trace element ratio. And then going up here, looking at these major element oxides, we would expect that assimilation and fractional crystallization of the crust would drive those amounts up in response to increasing magnesium as well. What we see in this setting, though, is both assimilation and fractional crystallization, but instead of a crustal sort of country rock, that magma is actually assimilating gabbro-sill complexes. And what we imagine this might look like is this mid-crustal sill complex between 10 and 20 kilometers depth, which is a product of high heat flow in the aftermath of silicic caldera-forming volcanism. That's kind of the direct product of the Yellowstone plume impinging on continental crust. So this is kind of the incubation area for all of these Snake River Plain basalt flows that have erupted over the last 5 million years. It's coming through the mid-crustal sill and assimilating and fractionally crystallizing, which lends these unique geochemical characteristics, which we can identify. Okay, another thing we can do with basalts, and this is kind of more physical or intro geology review, is use them to understand the timing of processes. And paleomagnetic reversals, polarity reversals, which signify the orientation of magnetic north relative to geographic north, are one of the key clues that were used to support plate tectonic theory. And they're a product of the alignment of iron-rich minerals crystallizing out of lavas. These iron-rich minerals, as they're cooling, align with Earth's dipole and record the magnetic field in the location where they crystallize. So there's two kind of areas of paleomagnetism that are useful for us when we look at basalts. And the first is declination. This is the deviation of the magnetic north from true north or geographic north. And this has changed through time. This is constantly kind of moving around. And we actually have a really good record of declination changes through time, at least over the last 400 years. The other clue we can obtain from paleomagnetic records or the alignment of these magnetic grains is inclination. And this is kind of a way to think about it is like the dip of the magnetic field at the location where the lava erupts. So those magnetic grains align with the magnetic field wherever they form. This is useful information, of course. It gives us information about how Earth's magnetic field has changed and it is changing. But what makes it extremely valuable for understanding long-term volcanic processes is this paleomagnetic timescale. So this is resolved, or this is kind of used in concert with argon-argon and uranium-lead ages. And so we have this really nice record of paleomagnetic shifts, not only polarity reversals, which are shown in those black and white bands, but also inclination, a subtle shift in the magnetic field over time. So we'll talk a little bit about how that information is used in a few slides. Okay, so how do we get basalt out of the ground? we drill it. This is scientific drilling is pretty similar to any other type of drilling. What really sets it apart is it's very carefully done so that we have a great depth record, a really accurate record of where rocks are pulled from the subsurface. So then we can kind of use a little bit of relative dating perspectives to understand when processes took place through time, and then eventually obtain more quantitative data from geochemistry or geochronology. In oceanic settings, this is a lot more difficult than just drilling down and pulling rock out. You have to have a special drill ship. This is the Geodes Resolution, which has been retired, but there's other drill ships around that do similar things, and that drill ship has to kind of stay in position as the drill pipe is laid down, and then you drill into the seafloor and then pull that core up eventually, where it's then processed in the lab spaces on the drill ship. So it's a little bit more difficult, and the core that's obtained from these deep sea settings is very precious because it's essentially like a moon rock. It's really difficult to go out and resample. Okay, let's talk about mantle plumes. So this is another kind of area of geology that's been really growing, and our understanding of plume processes has significantly increased over the last 40 years. And what we understand these to be is really thermochemical pulses of material from the core mantle boundary. They're influenced by subduction zones. So the subduction of oceanic lithosphere, sometimes that material stalls out at the transition zone between the upper and lower mantle. But oftentimes it goes all the way to the core mantle boundary, where it causes perturbations and likely causes this upwelling of hot material in response. Most mantle plumes originate from two main kind of centers, called these LLSVPs, or large low shear wave or shear velocity provinces. There's one in the Pacific Ocean. It's larger. Its nickname is Jason, and it's kind of the origin point for these big plume systems like the Hawaii Emperor and Tahiti. Over in the Atlantic Ocean, at the antipode of the Jason LLSVP, is the Tuzo LLSVP, and that is the sort of surface from which plumes like St. Helena and Guff and Tristan originate from, as well as Iceland. And we can see these from tomography. They're extremely hot and dense kind of pockets of material at that core mantle boundary. The models for plumes have really shaped or have really evolved through time as well. This early mushroom model is sort of one of the first idealized mechanisms for plume behavior. And now we're kind of in this field where we know the LLSVPs are involved, but it's likely that these aren't just kind of narrow, elegant channels of hot material from the core mantle boundary. They probably branch off and in some cases trifurcate and cause complex volcanic features on the surface. One thing, as a little bit of a segue into the next slide, that mantle plumes can do, and this is one reason for showing this early model for plume behavior, is as the mantle plume moves up through the mantle and initially hits the lithosphere, it forms this plume head. And that plume head is enormous, has an enormous volume and enormous heat flow, and so it causes huge amounts of melting to take place in the lithosphere and the creation of flood basalts. And this could be continental lithosphere or oceanic. Either way, you produce flood basalts. And again, these are vast outpourings of basaltic lava. After that plume head dissipates, we migrate into this tail volcanism, and that's what creates hotspot tracks or sequences of caldera-forming eruptions, depending on whether we're in oceanic or continental crust. So this large igneous province, this vast outpouring of flood basalts, can create conditions where continents break apart. This is Gondwana from 200 million years to 100 million years. And two plumes are thought to be responsible for the breakup of Africa and South America during the opening of the Southern Atlantic Ocean. So this is St. Helena and Tristan. The Tristan plume is associated with the Paraná and Etendeka flood basalts. Paraná is in South America and Etendeka is over here in Africa. And so that is the plume head interacting with the Africa and South American plates right as this sort of opening is occurring. The other product of these plume head volcanic eruptions are climatic shifts. So think of greenhouse atmospheric conditions, really high temperatures, lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, oceanic and anoxic events, and then associated with these extinctions. And so we know at least one extinction event is associated with a flood basalt eruption. The Siberian traps, 252 MA, are thought to be kind of a major contribution to the Permian Triassic extinction that wiped out, I don't know, like 90% of species. Other notable examples, the Deccan traps at the end of the Cretaceous probably played a role in the extinction of the dinosaurs. So these plume processes are really important in understanding other systems on Earth. Okay, to summarize, plumes provide these large-scale clues, large spatial clues of processes, whether it's plate movement, continental breakup, and we can really pinpoint these processes by using basalt drill core and sampling these areas in detail to understand processes through time. All right. Okay, so let's take a quick time machine break. We're going to go back 10 million years ago to this location, right outside of present-day Twin Falls, on the margin of the Twin Falls caldera. And we would have instant regrets about landing here because it would be just a scene out of a disaster movie. Vast outpourings of rhyolite ash, just a very inhospitable environment. This is the product of caldera-forming volcanism. This is the product of the plume interacting with continental crust and melting that continental crust and creating large bodies of rhyolitic magma. And this occurred kind of in sequence through plume tail volcanism as the North American plate moved over the Yellowstone plume. After that plume, though, or after the North American plate moved, shifted a little bit, and plume magmatism kind of migrates to the northeast, what we're left with in this same location is a very different scene. So 6 million years ago, if we set our time machine clock and arrived outside of Twin Falls, we would think we were in Hawaii or Iceland today. See these Hohoe lava flows coming out of shield volcanoes. It's much more hospitable. And this is actually a product not of direct plume magmatism, but the heat flow, high heat flow left over from that plume magmatism and kind of the erosion of continental crust in response to plume impingement as that plate is moving over the top. This is not directly related to our delicious potatoes that come from Idaho, but most of the potato and sugar beet growing conditions or fields are on top of these basalt lava flows, which are also great little repositories for loess. Okay, so some of the research questions for the Yellowstone Snake River Plain, thinking about the Yellowstone plume and how it's interacted with the continental crust, or what sorts of petrogenetic processes are at work in this location. So how is magma changing? Where's that magma coming from, and how is it changing through time? And then can we figure out the timing of magma petrogenesis and volcanism to better understand what's going on here? And to kind of zoom out, I mentioned this a little bit, but how this plume is interacting with the continental crust is quite important. And I want to draw your attention kind of first over here, this part of the figure. And we have the plume and it's partially melting. That partial melt is accumulating at this kind of moho boundary between the upper mantle and the lower crust. And it's melting overlying material, partially melting this. And this partial melt accumulates at shallower depths as rhyolitic partial melts. But we can also have, due to extension in response to the uplift caused by this high heat flow, basaltic partial melts that migrate all the way up here and then can eventually erupt onto the surface. So at places like Yellowstone, continental hotspots, we can have two very different magmas erupted onto the surface as lava. And that's described by bimodal volcanism. So in the Snake River Plain, this is a data set from Eric Christensen. Snake River Plain basalts are blue, and then we have all of our rhyolites from Yellowstone. Those can both be erupted in the same continental plume setting. What we see, though, mostly in the Snake River Plain are these sort of aftermath of plume volcanism, which is this emplacement of the mid-crustal sill. So as the North American plate is migrating over the Yellowstone plume, what's left is this high heat flow and this kind of opening for basaltic partial melts to rise and accumulate in these sill complexes, which then feed subsequent eruptions on the Snake River Plain. I've strategically made this a big dip here. We have high heat flow, as I mentioned, and uplift in the Yellowstone area, but below the Snake River Plain, this is all sinking under the weight of this extremely dense mid-crustal sill complex. And we can actually see this in the sort of physiographic profile of the Snake River Plain. It's kind of sunk down relative to everything around it. All right, so that veneer of basalts that's on the surface, it's covering all of these Miocene, Pliocene, rhyolite eruptions, is one of the kind of big mysteries of this area. Because the basalts are covering rhyolites and we don't actually know how thick the basalts are, there's been a lot of interest in drilling through here and kind of documenting volcanic stratigraphy. And what that work has shown is that we have, again, this thick pile of rhyolitic ash flow tufts, and then these individual eruptions from little shield volcanoes. So these aren't the Kilauea shield volcanoes, they're not the massive sort of island-forming shield volcanoes in oceanic crust. These are what we call low shields, and they're produced by monogenetic volcanism. And that's just basically you have a magma chamber, and it's erupting lavas over maybe a few hundred years, and then it stops, it's done. So you don't continually regenerate that magma chamber. It's kind of just a sort of a one and done situation. And what makes the Snake River Plain so interesting is you have very frequent eruptions of volcanoes, of shield volcanoes from those monogenetic magma chambers that pile on top of each other and create almost 2 kilometers of basalt in the central Snake River Plain. All right, and what does that look like if we zoom in? So thinking about a vent from a monogenetic magma, you erupt it over tens of some decades up to 100 years. And those flows kind of stack next to each other around the vent, but they don't stack directly on top of each other. So basalt flows always kind of seek the path of least resistance. They seek out low topography. So they kind of build up around each other. And then eventually maybe you've built that surface up, and so new basalt flows can overlie pre-existing basalt flows. When we look at basalt flows, and this is all kind of categorized as a flow group, all of the eruptions from a single magma chamber, but we can look at different parts of those flows and start to understand processes like flow breakup, as these are pohoihoi flows kind of inflating and then outbursting from the front, the flow front. So we see all of these different features when we look at drill core. And here's some drill core. So this is from the Kaimana core. This is about 2 kilometers of basalt that was obtained in the central Snake River Plain. And you look at this and it's, this was erupted probably at least a few 100,000 years ago, but it's very fresh looking. It looks like it just erupted. We see the same sorts of flow features that we would see today in Hawaii, including pohoihoi flow tops, kind of ropey surfaces. We see rubbly flow bases. We see vesicles that accumulate kind of toward the top and base of the lava flow. So we can use this record, this sort of volcanic facies that we observe, to put together a volcanic stratigraphy. And even if we don't have age dates or geochemistry, we can start to kind of piece together a volcanic history using drill core by looking at flow thickness and kind of the morphology of these flows to interpret volcanic processes from really old periods to much younger periods. If we do have geochemical information, though, we can really tell a powerful story. So using our volcanic stratigraphy, our recognition that individual magma chambers erupt packages of lava as flow groups, which I've color-coded. So each one of these represent a distinct magma chamber. We have separation by sediment interbeds. We can look at major element geochemistry and variations that we see within those flow groups, going from more primitive or lower amounts of iron and titanium and phosphorus to higher amounts of those elements, and start to put together a sort of relative timing of magma petrogenesis. So what these arrows represent, red arrows, show fractional crystallization, which is the progressive removal of mafic mineral phases, and that magma is becoming more felsic with time. And in the blue areas represent the opposite trend. And this might represent a new magma, a more mafic magma entering the system, kind of mixing with that existing magma and driving compositions back toward primitive or more mafic values. So this sort of sequence of fractional crystallization, these red arrows, and recharge is documented throughout the drill core. I want to point out I'm only showing you the upper 1,000 meters of drill core here because everything below is gotten kind of screwed up by the Snake River Plain aquifer. It's been kind of hot over time. And so we have a lot of clays and alteration down here. So this is the fresh stuff. This is the stuff that's particularly interesting for interpreting geochemistry. And again, here's the Kaimana drill core right here in the smack dab of the center of the Snake River Plain. And so it's this complete record of volcanism over what are probably long timescales. And actually, we've been able to date several of these flows using argon-argon. And then we found some fluvial interbeds down here, which had quite a few detrital zircons. So we were able to obtain uranium lead ages for those. And what we have is a pretty nice linear accumulation rate or a record of volcanism. I should point out, we also use paleomagnetic data that again is sort of reconciled to our geomagnetic polarity timescale. And this gives us an accumulation rate of about 320 meters per every million years. So 320 million years or 320 meters of basalt erupts every million years in this part of the Snake River. The entire core represents about 6 million years of volcanism. But one question we have here is if we could do better. Can we get a better sense of how rapid volcanism occurred and then tie that back to our petrogenetic processes, understand the timing of fractional crystallization? And we can do that using paleosecular variation, which is this inclination, the dip of the magnetic field, which varies through time. And we can actually look at the change in dip within our flow groups and potentially determine the timing of what's going on over here. And this work is really based on foundational studies by Hagstrom and Dwayne Champion, who's a famous in Snake River Plain world. And what they found looking at volcanics in Oregon, the same latitude as the Snake River Plain, is that there's sort of these three main boxes of inclination variation within these volcanic, within these samples. And drawing regression lines through these points and calculating the change in dip over really short time scales, we can begin to kind of identify trends. In this first box from present day to about 35,000 or 3,500 years ago, a change in 1 degree represent of a decade to about 200 years of time. So it's telling us how that inclination is, how the rate of change. In the second box, which is 6,000 to about 7,000 years, that change in 1 degree is equivalent to a decade to 150 years of time. And in this third box, the 1 degree change could represent a decade to 70 years. So averaging all of these out, we get the average inclination change of about 1/2 of a degree occurs every decade. We can add a decimal or shift this over, and calculate our rate of change every century, so 4.5 degrees change. Using our inclination record, we can multiply that average value by the inclinations we see in these flow groups and start to determine kind of a time or a sort of a temporal information about the rate of these processes. So in that uppermost flow, using that average rate, we determine that these flow groups erupted over 380 years. Down here, where we have no paleosecular variation over this thicker sequence, that could have taken less than 20 years to erupt. And in adding our fractional crystallization information, we can calculate the degree of fractional crystallization by taking this more primitive value down here and this most evolved number and calculate the rate that fractional crystallization or the amount of fractional crystallization that would have occurred to produce that shift. And so with this information combined, we can again start to piece together how fast these processes occurred. Instead of volcanism occurring over the 2.85 million years that this drill core represents, using our paleomagnetic and argon-argon and uranium-lead linear accumulation rate, we can see that it's much quicker, 22,000 years to 220,000 years of volcanism represented. And those fractionation and recharge rates occur over rapid timescales as well. And our sediment interbeds represent really long periods of volcanic hiatus. One thing to point out here is that, I mentioned this earlier, when these basalt flows erupt from a vent, they're not stacking right on top of each other. So drill core is never a complete record of volcanism. We actually are probably making a lower estimate of the duration of volcanism because we're not sampling a continuous record through time. So this is rapid emplacement followed by long hiatus, but we recognize that volcanism is continuing or is occurring elsewhere in the Snake River Plain during this time. Okay, now we're gonna jump on a ship, sail from Cape Town up the Walvis Ridge hotspot track and sample some locations that represent the breakup of Africa and South America in response to the impingement of the Tristan plume on these continental crustal settings. This plume is really weird. This hotspot track, I should say, is really different than some of the other hotspot tracks that we see represented on the seafloor, like the Emperor Hawaii Seamount track, because we go from this kind of broad plateau province, which we call the Walvis Ridge, down to these trifurcating geos, which is a fancy way of naming seamounts in this lower portion here. And what this represents initially is this flood basalt province. The plume head is interacting with continental crust. And then this is that initial opening of the South Atlantic. The mid-Atlantic ridge is interacting with the plume kind of all through here. And then at this stage, right at about 70 million years ago, we lose the mid-ocean ridge, it migrates to the west, and this is just the plume interacting, the plume tail interacting with oceanic crust. So this has been a really interesting area for geologists because it's so visible, because it's so weird looking, and because it's still active. So the sort of terminus of these hotspot tracks at Tristan da Cunha and Guff Island are still active volcanic islands. And because it represents the opening of the South Atlantic, it's a really interesting sort of test case for plume processes. One of the other interesting findings here is that this is a geochemically zoned hotspot track, which isn't novel. Hawaii has some geochemical zonation as well. But this is interesting because we have this long-lived geochemical signature, which shows up in lead isotopes. And then this later signature, the Tristan track, shows up much later, about 70 million years ago. And it's this distinct kind of flavor of ocean island basalt. The other mysterious thing is found in the center track. We don't actually have drill core record of center track magnetism or geochemistry before expedition 391, but the dredge samples that were obtained by previous expeditions indicate that this center track has a unique composition as well. So some of the models for explaining this is that the Guff track, that really long-lived compositional signature is pulling from the LLSVP, which has this enriched sample or enriched composition. And the Tristan track is pulling from a different geochemical reservoir, which gives it that zone character. And we don't really know what the center track is doing, whether it's its own distinct source or whether it represents mixing between the Tristan and Guff samples. And so to answer this question, we drilled a lot of sites as part of Expedition 391. And this is the one I'll be talking about, right in the middle of the center track, the longest record of center track volcanism that has ever been obtained. So very exciting rocks. So the biggest question, I guess the more general question, is what petrogenetic processes occur in oceanic crust? And how does magma petrogenesis differ within the Tristan-Guff-Walvis hotspot track, or in other words, a plume system? And this isn't just looking at those other tracks, this is also looking at a single location and how that petrogenesis or how magma petrogenesis can vary through time. So just to set the scene, this is the Walvis, or this is the stratigraphy for site 1578. It's mostly pillow basalts, these sort of colors, light green, with a few sheet flows and massive flows. And mineralogically, it's pretty uniform. We got olivine and pyroxene and plagioclase, and these are all classified based on major element chemistry as ocean island basalts. What's interesting, though, is if we look at other element ratios or other element concentrations, we can start to pick out some unique signatures in 1578. And the first is that it's very high in titanium. This is even compared to other ocean island basalts. We have these high titanium lavas that are about 2 to 3.5 weight% titanium, and then 3.5 to almost 5% weight% titanium are these very high titanium lavas. And they're very distinct among the Walvis, or among the Tristan-Guff-Walvis system. So I'll show you in a second. They're also distinct within the stratigraphy of 1578. So we go from our lower high titanium and upper high titanium that kind of sandwich this middle very high titanium basalt. And if we look at trace elements, those incompatible through more compatible elements, we see some distinct trends, most of which kind of align with what we understand ocean island basalts to look like. I'll show you that, those sort of fields here. But what stands out in looking at these is that they are, especially very high titanium, they have this big peak, which other ocean island basalts don't exhibit. And so understanding the source of that very high titanium has kind of been a side project that has occupied my interest here. But getting back to the original question, are these 1578 lavas that are sampled in the central track, are they more Guff or are they more Tristan, or where do they come from? And when we plot these with existing data sets from these different locations, we see that the 1578 samples kind of straddle this Walvis Ridge Guff track boundary and maybe overlap a little bit with the Tristan track as well. And as a reminder, the Walvis Ridge part right here documents that interaction with the mid-Atlantic ridge. So it's a little bit more influenced by upper mantle compositions. And then we get to Guff track, that's got that enriched mantle 1 signature, and Tristan has a few different components mixed in. But we're kind of sitting right in the middle here, Walvis and Guff track, 1578. So these are kind of a distinct geochemical signature that might represent maybe a little bit of interaction between the Walvis and the Guff components. If we look at our trace elements again, you can see that the 1578 samples are more enriched than some of the other locations where we see high titanium and very high titanium flows. These Guff high titanium samples are a little interesting. They're from the GeoRock database. I'll have to go back and make sure that I trust them. But we see that high titanium signature pop up in 1578, and it's not as pronounced in those other high titanium samples. So unique geochemistry in these 1578 lavas. So trying to figure out where this is coming from. What are what is the petrogenesis of 1578? What is kind of lending it, or what processes are lending themselves to these geochemical characteristics? We've been working a lot using models from Vilbold and Strack and trying to figure out degrees of partial melt and source compositions. And one of the things that we've tested and sort of come to as maybe a possible solution for replicating high titanium trends in 1578 is this partial melt of a garnet peridotite source. So low degrees of partial melt can replicate some of the trends that we see in our incompatible elements and those more compatible elements. And so one mechanism for doing this is actually incorporating continental derived material. So this is basically sediment from the continental crust that's pulled down during subduction and then pulled in to the mantle plume. And this creates an enriched peridotite source, which then can create these types of trace element compositions when partially melted. If we want to replicate that high titanium signature, though, in the very high titanium flows in the central track, or 1578, we have to do something additional to that enriched peridotite partial melting. And one of the ways that we can do this is an eclogite source. So if we invoke eclogite veins or dikes within the upper mantle, we can partially melt those and create similar trace element patterns and compatible element patterns. And more importantly, kind of get this high titanium spike represented that shows up in these very high titanium flows. So one mechanism, one sort of proposed mechanism for doing this, again, is this plume is interacting with the eclogite, which give that really high titanium compositional trend. Okay, so some of the takeaways from this talk. Magma petrogenesis, as we might expect, operates very differently from within oceanic versus continental plume settings. And this is well represented in geochemical data. One of the sort of caveats in comparing the Yellowstone and Walvis systems are that the Walvis system actually represent primary plume interactions with the oceanic crust in that location. And at Yellowstone, most of our basalts on the surface of the Snake River Plain are a product of secondary heat flow and kind of the aftermath of plume magmatism and the generation of these rhyolite magmas. The second takeaway is that magma petrogenesis and volcanism occurs over rapid timescales. We see that from our paleosecular variation data, and we can kind of map that to fractional crystallization and see these processes really occurring quite quickly, probably in response to that high heat flow left over from the plume. And then the third takeaway, even within a single drill site, we see various petrogenetic processes taking place in the within the center track. And we'll need to collect some more data and do some more modeling, but it looks like the center track is not sampling a brand new source. It's probably some proportion of mixing with that Guff and Walvis source. So lots of folks have helped with this research. Basically, two projects are represented here in this presentation. Project Hotspot, which sampled all of those drill cores in the Snake River Plain, and an IODP Expedition 391. And none of this could have been done without the help of the science technicians on the JOIDES resolution, who were really helpful and good morale boosters. And then my collaborators, especially John Gervais, have been really big helps. And kind of the biggest thank you goes to the undergraduate researchers, especially Drew here. Drew's a grad student at Colorado State, doing cool basalt research in Yellowstone National Park. So with that, I will take your questions. Yeah. That's a great question. I didn't discuss that in here. This core was, well, Yeah. I don't have any idea of that record. And we do have age dates for this, and we also have our biostratigrapher data, but I didn't present that today. So I can get you that information though. Yes.
Lava flow. And the way with it. So what are the evidence that those are actually reactivation?
Oh, that's a great question, Sarah. So one thing I guess to initially point out is that the Snake River Plain lavas, the Snake River Plain basalts are not what we would classify as a flood basalt province. I think what we sort of pin as the flood basalt province associated with the Yellowstone plume is the Columbia River basalts. And those are all, fissure eruptions that occurred over really rapid timescales. These low shield volcanoes, these monogenetic magma chambers, are the product of sort of partial melting and differentiation in the mid-crustal sill complex, which itself is there because of residual high heat from the plume. And so you just get little pulses, little magmas that come up and kind of stagnate and erupt and then cycle repeats. So they're kind of building up together, these little, I guess, individual magmas that only really erupt for a century or so, if that answers your question. Yeah.
I have a question that ties your cross sections of the basalts and your data on the treatment of. I wonder, your data have also depletion in expansion that corresponds to the increase.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see basalts?
Yeah, they are mostly pillow basalts in that high titanium, very high titanium.
Element quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be circulation of fluids that are affecting some of those rocks?
Absolutely. Yeah, that strontium could be pulled out through secondary interactions with fluids. So that's a really great suggestion. Yeah, and these are high temperature systems, of course. One of the things I was telling Marie about is we actually accidentally drilled into a massive sulfide deposit out here. And we're finding marcasite and pyrite and native copper. So we have that heat flow and certainly fluids that can be circulating and stripping away these fluid mobile elements. What's interesting though is that we don't see that, and I didn't show potassium in my spider diagram, but we don't see that same depletion in potassium as well. So that would be worth thinking about though, is it just strontium that's being pulled in? Yeah, any other questions? Yeah, sorry.
What have you mentioned? Way shallower.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I didn't cover in here, but one of the models is an integration of subcontinental lithospheric mantle that's partially melting and giving these compositional trends. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done to look at these trends and figure out what they mean.